Research log entry number 47. Dr. Kellerman, Radiation Physics Division. New Haven Outpost, Sector 7. Day 73 post-Blackwater. The Geiger's clicking in patterns again. Not random background radiation, actual patterns. Morse-like sequences that repeat every 47 seconds, give or take the equipment drift we've been ignoring since the third generator failure. Click, click, pause, click. Click, click, pause, click. I've been staring at this readout for... Christ, what time is it? My watch stopped working when that electromagnetic pulse from the Blackwater site fried half our instruments. The wall clock reads 0347, but that thing's been stuck on 0347 for 2 days now. Could be morning, could be afternoon. The perpetual gray haze outside these reinforced windows makes it impossible to tell. Dr. Hale stopped by earlier, or was it yesterday, asking for my baseline readings from the initial survey. Standard procedure, she said. Quality control for the quarterly report to the Radiation Safety Commission. I handed over the files, though something felt off about her interest in the pre-contamination data. Like she was looking for something specific. The metallic taste is getting stronger. Started as a faint copper penny on my tongue 3 shifts ago. Now it's like I've been chewing aluminum foil. My grandfather used to develop photographs in his basement darkroom, and the chemical smell down there had this same quality. Sharp, almost electric. He'd emerged from that red-lit cave with his hands stained purple-black from developer solution, warning me about the shadow chemicals that could burn through skin if you weren't careful. Click, click, pause, click. There it is again. The pattern's so consistent I've started tapping it out on my desk without realizing. My colleague Voss thinks I'm losing it, but I've run the statistical analysis 6 times. The probability of this being random background radiation is less than 0.003%. Something's creating these pulses. The equipment hums differently now too. Used to be a steady electrical drone, white noise you'd tune out after a few hours. Now there's a harmonic underneath, almost musical. Like the radiation detectors are trying to sing. I mentioned this to Hale during our last briefing, but she just made a note on her tablet and said, equipment fatigue. We'll requisition replacements after the current study phase concludes. Study phase. As if we're not sitting in the middle of a contaminated wasteland because some idiot at Blackwater thought they could contain a partial meltdown with wishful thinking and bureaucratic optimism. The shadows outside have been wrong since we arrived. I know that sounds unscientific. Shadows don't have moral qualities. They're simply the absence of photons hitting a surface. But these ones stretch in directions that don't match the light sources. The emergency floods illuminate the compound from the northwest. Yet I keep seeing elongated darkness reaching toward the southeast, like fingers grasping for something beyond the fence line. Could be an optical effect. Radiation can cause atmospheric distortion, bending light in unexpected ways. I've read studies about gamma emissions creating visual artifacts. The eye's photoreceptors misinterpreting high-energy particles as phantom imagery. Maybe it's the stress. 73 days of 12-hour shifts analyzing contamination patterns, mapping isotope distribution, pretending we're conducting environmental assessment instead of documenting a slow-motion catastrophe. Sleep deprivation does things to visual processing. I learned that during graduate school when I'd spend 48 hours straight in the lab, watching particle collision data until I started seeing faces in the scatter plots. Click, click, pause, click. I should check the cesium-137 levels in Sector 12. The readings from my last survey, whenever that was, showed an increase from the previous measurements. But the exact percentages escape me now. 12%? 21%? My handwriting's deteriorated since we got here, and the numbers swim together when I try to focus. Used to pride myself on neat, precise documentation. Now my field notes look like they were written during an earthquake. The ventilation system just kicked in, pumping what we optimistically call filtered air through the facility. It carries that ozone smell you get before thunderstorms, except there's something else underneath. Something organic and wrong, like vegetables rotting in a microwave. Hale's been asking a lot of questions about our evacuation timeline lately. Casual inquiries during briefings. How long would it take to pack the essential data? And which samples are truly irreplaceable? She frames it as standard contingency planning, but I've noticed her having frequent private conversations with the communications team. Hushed meetings in the sealed conference room that stop when other staff approach. Just updating protocols, she told me when I asked yesterday. Or was it 2 days ago? Time's become fluid here. The Geiger counter just spiked. 340 milliroentgens per hour, up from the background 280 we've been recording. That's not supposed to happen. The contamination patterns have been stable for 2 weeks. Increasing slowly, predictably, following the mathematical models I developed based on atmospheric dispersion and soil absorption rates. Except I can't remember the exact baseline anymore. Was it 280 or 260? The fatigue is making everything blur together. Wait, let me recheck the calibration settings. Maybe I transposed the baseline values when I copied them from where? I handed those files to Hale, but I should have backup copies in my personal log. My personal log is empty. Not corrupted. Not damaged. Empty. 73 days of meticulous measurements, theoretical calculations, exposure projections gone. The computer shows file creation dates going back to day 1, but every document contains nothing but blank headers and my digital signature. Click, click, pause, click. The pattern's faster now. More urgent. Like a heartbeat accelerating. I need to find Voss. He'll have copies of the data, backup readings we can cross-reference. Or maybe I should report this to Hale first. Data corruption is a serious issue that could compromise the entire research mission. But something about her recent behavior makes me hesitate. Those questions about evacuation timelines. Those private meetings. The shadows outside just moved. Not swayed by wind. There is no wind. The air's been dead still since the electromagnetic disturbance 3 days ago killed the weather monitoring station. These shadows shifted independently, pulling away from their sources like they were trying to escape. I'm going to blame the exhaustion. 73 days of breathing contaminated air, eating irradiated rations, documenting the slow death of everything within a 15-mile radius. The human mind wasn't designed to process this level of environmental hostility on a continuous basis. Hallucinations are a documented side effect of prolonged stress exposure. Click, click, pause, click, click. The pattern just changed. End research log entry number 47. Note, Dr. Kellerman's subsequent entries become increasingly fragmented. Equipment malfunctions reported to maintenance division show no corresponding work orders in the system database. Administrative review, Dr. R. Hale. Research log entry number 51. Dr. Kellerman, Radiation Physics Division. New Haven Outpost, Sector 7. Day 76 post-Blackwater. Weather status, incoming precipitation event. The clouds arrived like a gray funeral shroud, rolling in from the northwest, directly over the Blackwater site. I should have expected this. Atmospheric pressure's been dropping steadily for the past 18 hours, and the electromagnetic readings have gone completely haywire. The storm front carries more than just water vapor. I'm crouched in the collection bay, assembling precipitation sampling equipment while the first droplets spatter against the reinforced glass dome above. Each drop that hits the surface leaves a faint luminescent trail, barely visible, but definitely there. The Geiger counter strapped to my belt is chattering constantly now, not in the rhythmic patterns I documented before, but in rapid, overlapping bursts. Click, 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 click. My hands are shaking as I adjust the spectrometer. Could be the cold. Temperatures dropped 12 degrees in the past hour. Could be the adrenaline. Could be the early stages of radiation sickness, though I've been telling myself the symptoms are just stress and sleep deprivation. The protocol clearly states, monitor exposure levels hourly during active contamination events. But wait, I'm second-guessing myself. Was it hourly or daily? The sleep deprivation has me mixing up critical procedures. I can't find my copy of the manual anymore. Like the baseline data, it's simply gone from my files. I've been operating on memory, and my memory feels like it's been put through a blender. Voss appeared beside me 20 minutes ago. No, wait, it was longer than that. Time keeps slipping sideways here. He was carrying a field kit and muttering about Dr. Hale's new priority sampling directive. She wants samples from the primary impact zone, he said, gesturing toward the fence line where our instruments can barely function in the radiation field. Priority directive from the Research Safety Commission. Something about updating the evacuation window calculations. Evacuation timeline. There's that phrase again. Hale's been dropping it into conversations with increasing frequency, always paired with urgent requests for data that would only matter if we were planning to leave. Fast. What's the rush? I asked Voss, but he was already sealing his collection vials, avoiding eye contact. That's when I noticed the rash creeping up his neck, red, blotchy patches that hadn't been there during yesterday's briefing. Equipment malfunction, he said quickly. Faulty radiation badge gave me a false reading. Skin's just irritated from the decontamination scrub. Liar. I've seen radiation dermatitis before, during my internship at the Particle Accelerator facility in Denver. It starts as a mild sunburn sensation, then progresses to weeping lesions if the exposure continues. Voss is hiding something, and his equipment malfunction explanation sounds rehearsed. The rain's intensifying now. I can hear it drumming against the facility's metal roof with increasing urgency, each drop carrying its payload of cesium and strontium isotopes down from the contaminated cloud mass. My collection funnel is already half full of luminescent water that glows like liquid starlight. The anti-radiation treatment I administered this morning should protect me for another 6 hours. The synthetic chelating compounds bind to radioactive particles in the bloodstream, facilitating rapid excretion before cellular damage occurs. It's a brilliant piece of biochemistry, assuming the pH levels remain stable, which they won't. I just tested the rain sample. pH 3.2 and dropping. The contaminated precipitation is acidic enough to denature proteins, which means my carefully calibrated anti-rad medication is breaking down faster than my liver can process it. The chelating molecules are fragmenting in the acidic environment, releasing their captured isotopes back into my bloodstream. I'm essentially poisoning myself with my own countermeasure. My grandfather used to tell stories about the old photography chemicals, how the developer solution would eat through rubber gloves if you left them soaking too long. Chemistry doesn't care about your intentions, he'd say, holding up his purple-stained fingers. Acid's gonna acid, boy. Respect the process or it'll disrespect you right back. The process is disrespecting me right back. 8 hours until the storm passes. That's the weather prediction, though I'm questioning whether our meteorological data is reliable anymore. 8 hours of radioactive acid rain soaking into everything, the soil, the groundwater, our supposedly sealed facility. The contamination modeling I've been working on suggests levels will spike beyond our measurement capabilities. But I keep losing track of the baseline values. Was the initial reading 280 milliroentgens? Or 180? My memory feels fragmented, like someone's been editing my thoughts. I need to collect more samples before the concentrations peak, but the radiation alarms are screaming warnings every time I approach the collection zone. The red lights strobing across my face feel like disco balls in hell. My dosimeter badge should be recording all this exposure data, creating a permanent record of just how badly I'm irradiating myself for the sake of scientific documentation. Except when I checked it 10 minutes ago, the badge was blank. Completely white, as if it had never been exposed to radiation at all. Either the badge is malfunctioning, or something's actively erasing the exposure record. Given the pattern of missing data I've been discovering, I'm leaning toward the latter explanation. I just attempted to establish radio contact with Dr. Hale, but she's not responding on any frequency. The communication logs show her last transmission was 2 days ago, a brief message to an external contact about data security protocols. The timestamp matches exactly when my baseline readings disappeared from the system. Too many coincidences. Missing data, malfunctioning equipment, Hale's sudden interest in evacuation timelines. She's covering something up, manipulating our exposure records. But why? The shadows under the storm clouds are moving again. Definite, purposeful movement that doesn't correspond to any light source I can identify. They're stretching toward the facility like dark fingers, reaching across the contaminated landscape with what appears to be deliberate intent. I need to document this phenomenon properly. Set up the time-lapse camera, establish measurement protocols, gather quantitative data instead of relying on subjective observations that could be compromised by exposure-induced hallucinations. I need to reach Hale immediately and report the chelator breakdown. If the entire team is using compromised anti-radiation treatment, we're looking at mass exposure casualties. But her office remains locked, her quarters empty. The duty roster shows she's supposed to be on site, but no one's seen her since she collected my baseline data. The administrative notes in my files are signed with her authorization code, but the timestamps don't match her physical presence. Someone's been using her access credentials to alter our records. It's like she's vanished, taking half the facility's documentation with her. The rain is falling harder now, each drop carrying its radioactive payload deeper into the contaminated earth. My collection bottles are overflowing with glowing liquid that hums with barely contained energy. The storm is transforming this landscape into something that shouldn't exist on Earth, a place where water itself has become a weapon. Click, 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 click. The Geiger counter's rhythm has changed again. More complex now, almost like Morse code. If I didn't know better, I'd say it was trying to communicate something, warning me about the approaching danger, or maybe counting down to some inevitable disaster. I'm going to run another spectrographic analysis on these rain samples, then track down Voss for a full equipment check. His faulty radiation badge story doesn't add up, and I need to know what he's really hiding under that protective suit. Something's wrong here. More wrong than just a contaminated storm system. The missing data, the malfunctioning equipment, Hale's suspicious questions about evacuation timelines. It all suggests a pattern I'm too exhausted to fully comprehend. But patterns are what I do. Mathematical relationships, statistical correlations, the hidden structures that govern radioactive decay. If someone's manipulating our data, covering up the true extent of this contamination event, I'll find the evidence. I just hope I live long enough to expose it. The storm rages on outside, washing the poison landscape with its luminescent tears. End research log entry number 51. Note: Dr. Kellerman's equipment malfunctions reported during this period coincide with unauthorized data access on the facility's main server. Security footage from the affected timeframe has been classified, pending administrative review. Dr. R. Hale, Research Director. Addendum: Maintenance records show no work orders for radiation badge replacements despite multiple reported failures. Current whereabouts of backup dosimetry equipment under investigation. Facility operations. Emergency research log entry number 52. Dr. Kellerman, Radiation Physics Division. New Haven Outpost, Sector 7. Day 76 post-Blackwater. Critical status. Facility breach imminent. The shadows aren't moving anymore. They're dancing. I'm writing this from Emergency Station C, 3 levels below ground, while contaminated floodwater seeps through the supposedly sealed blast doors above me. The phosphorescent liquid drips from the ceiling joints in steady rhythmic patterns, drip drop, like a radioactive metronome counting down to something I can't calculate. My clinical objectivity collapsed approximately 47 minutes ago when I found Voss unconscious in Laboratory 2, his radiation suit split open like an overripe fruit. The skin beneath was covered in weeping lesions that glowed faintly in the emergency lighting. Not the red irritation he claimed earlier. This was full-scale acute radiation syndrome, advanced enough that his cellular structure was literally breaking down at the molecular level. He'd been hiding symptoms for at least a week, maybe longer. The readings on his personal dosimeter, the one he claimed was malfunctioning, showed exposure levels that should have killed him 3 days ago. Yet he'd been walking around, collecting samples, following Hale's directives while his bone marrow shut down and his organs liquefied. That's when my carefully constructed theoretical framework finally shattered. I dragged Voss to the medical station, administered what remained of our potassium iodide supplies, and tried to establish contact with the outside world. The communication array responded with nothing but static, punctuated by fragments of what sounded like evacuation orders in multiple languages. French, German, something that might have been Russian. All of them using the same phrase: zone compromise imminent. Zone compromise, not contamination event or radiation leak. The clinical euphemisms we'd been using in our reports. This was military terminology. Emergency response protocol for catastrophic failure scenarios. That's when Dr. Hale finally decided to make her appearance. She emerged from the administrative section carrying a sealed briefcase and wearing a full hazmat suit. Not the standard issue gear the rest of us had been using, but military-grade protection I'd never seen in our equipment inventory. Her voice crackled through the suit's communication system with the calm, measured tone of someone reading from a prepared script. Dr. Kellerman, you need to evacuate immediately. The contamination levels have exceeded safe operational parameters. Exceeded? I laughed, and it came out as more of a hysterical bark. We passed safe operational parameters 3 days ago, when you started distributing those falsified contamination maps. The ones showing radiation levels at 50% of actual readings. She paused, tilting her helmet slightly. I don't know what you're referring to. The baseline data disappearing from my files. Voss's radiation badge mysteriously malfunctioning. Your convenient absence every time someone reported equipment problems. You've been systematically suppressing evidence of this contamination event since it began. That's a serious accusation. It's a serious crime. My voice echoed through the emergency station, bouncing off the reinforced walls like a trapped animal. How many people are going to die because you prioritized institutional credibility over human safety? Hale set down her briefcase and activated her suit's external speakers. When she spoke, her voice carried the flat, bureaucratic cadence I'd heard countless times in departmental meetings, the tone of someone who'd practiced deflecting responsibility until it became second nature. The Blackwater incident created unprecedented challenges for our research protocols. Certain data inconsistencies required administrative review before public release. My decisions were made in consultation with federal oversight committees to prevent unnecessary panic. Unnecessary panic? I gestured toward the emergency station's monitoring displays, where radiation readings flickered between red alarm states and complete system failure. The containment barriers are dissolving. The groundwater is contaminated with enough cesium-137 to poison 3 states. This entire facility is one structural failure away from becoming a radioactive crater, and you were worried about unnecessary panic? She opened the briefcase, revealing neat stacks of documentation and what appeared to be encrypted data drives. The situation was manageable until recent weather events accelerated the contamination dispersal. My reports to federal authorities accurately reflected the assessment parameters available at the time. Your reports were fiction. I've been tracking the real contamination levels, the ones you kept deleting from our databases. The atmospheric release from Blackwater wasn't a limited incident. It was a full containment breach that's been spreading radioactive material across the entire region for 76 days. The lights flickered as another surge of contaminated water breached the upper levels. Through the emergency station's reinforced windows, I could see the research compound flooding with phosphorescent liquid that moved with an almost organic fluidity. The water glowed with an intensity that hurt to look at directly, casting impossible shadows that seemed to dance independently of their sources. That's when I realized the shadows had been trying to warn me all along. Not hallucinations induced by radiation exposure, optical distortions caused by the electromagnetic fields generated by the contaminated water itself. The cesium isotopes were creating localized gravity wells, bending light around their decay signatures, and producing visual effects that my theoretical models had never accounted for. The shadows were showing me the shape of the disaster as it spread. You know what the worst part is? I said, watching the glowing floodwater seep through another seal. I actually believed your evacuation timeline story. Thought you were planning a responsible withdrawal once we'd collected enough data to properly assess the situation. The evacuation timeline is real, Hale said. My transport arrives in 40 minutes. There's room for essential personnel. Essential personnel. I stared at her through the hazmat suit's reflective visor, seeing my own radiation-burned face distorted in the polycarbonate surface. What about Voss? What about the maintenance staff who've been working in contaminated areas without proper protection? What about the communities downstream who don't even know their water supply is poisoned? She sealed the briefcase and activated her suit's mobility systems. Acceptable losses within established risk parameters. That phrase, acceptable losses within established risk parameters. I'd heard it before, buried in the bureaucratic language of federal disaster response protocols. It meant they'd already written off everyone who wasn't considered strategically valuable. The emergency station's atmospheric sensors started screaming as contaminated air began infiltrating through compromised filtration systems. The readings displayed numbers that should have been impossible, radiation levels high enough to cause cellular damage within minutes of exposure. My anti-radiation medication had completely broken down hours ago, leaving me with nothing but hope and increasingly irrational optimism. The compound is lost, Hale continued, moving toward the emergency exit. Federal containment protocols are already in effect. This area will be permanently quarantined within 72 hours. Permanently quarantined. I felt something break inside my chest, not physical, but the last remnant of trust in the systems I'd spent my career serving. You mean you're going to seal us inside and pretend this never happened? She paused at the exit, her helmeted figure silhouetted against the emergency lighting. The greater good sometimes requires difficult decisions, Dr. Kellerman. History will vindicate the necessity of our actions. History will remember you as the person who turned a containable incident into a regional catastrophe because you were more afraid of bad publicity than radioactive fallout. The exit sealed behind her with a hydraulic hiss, leaving me alone with the glowing floodwater and the dancing shadows and the Geiger counter that had started clicking in perfect 4/4 time, like a jazz drummer keeping tempo for the end of the world. I'm documenting everything now. Every falsified report, every suppressed reading, every administrative review that delayed critical safety measures until it was too late. The data drives in my equipment bag contain enough evidence to expose the entire cover-up, assuming I can survive long enough to deliver them to someone who gives a damn about the truth. The contaminated water is knee-deep now, soaking through my protective suit and carrying its payload of exotic isotopes directly into my circulatory system. I can taste metal on my tongue, feel the familiar burn of cellular damage spreading through my tissues. My vision is starting to fragment into prismatic patterns that shift and dance like the shadows I thought were hallucinations. But they weren't hallucinations. They were evidence. The shadows, the Geiger counter rhythms, the electromagnetic distortions, all of it was the disaster speaking to me in a language I'd been too arrogant to understand. Too convinced of my theoretical superiority to recognize that sometimes the most important data comes not from instruments and calculations, but from simply paying attention to what the world is trying to tell you. The floodwater is rising faster now, carrying debris from the upper levels and fragments of equipment that glow like underwater stars. The radiation levels have exceeded my dosimeter's measurement capacity. The display just shows a continuous line of red warning indicators that pulse in sync with my increasingly irregular heartbeat. I can see shapes moving in the contaminated water. Not shadows this time, but actual objects displaced by the flood. Chairs, computer terminals, chemical containers that bob and weave in the phosphorescent current like dancers in a ballroom made of poison. And there, floating just beneath the surface, Voss's personal research notes. The ones he'd been hiding from Hale, documenting the real contamination levels and the systematic suppression of safety protocols. His handwriting, increasingly illegible as radiation sickness affected his motor control, tracking the same patterns I'd discovered independently. We weren't the only ones who knew the truth. We were just the ones stupid enough to stay behind and document it. The emergency power is failing now, cycling between backup generators that struggle to maintain electrical systems in increasingly hostile environmental conditions. The lights flicker in patterns that almost seem purposeful, like Morse code signals transmitted through an infrastructure that's slowly dissolving into radioactive sludge. My final readings show atmospheric contamination at levels that exceed Chernobyl exclusion zone parameters by a factor of 12. The groundwater contamination extends in a rough circle approximately 40 kilometers from the Blackwater site, encompassing 2 major cities, 17 smaller communities, and the watershed that supplies drinking water to almost 500,000 people. All of it poisoned, all of it covered up, all of it designated acceptable losses within established risk parameters by bureaucrats who will never breathe this air or drink this water or watch their colleagues dissolve from the inside out. But the shadows showed me something else in those final moments before my vision completely deteriorated. A pattern in the contamination spread that suggests this wasn't entirely accidental. The isotope distribution follows geometric progressions that match theoretical models for controlled dispersal events, as if someone had been using the Blackwater site to test weaponized environmental contamination. The perfect crime: disguise a weapons test as an industrial accident, suppress the real data, evacuate the essential personnel, and quarantine the evidence along with everyone who might expose it. Dr. Hale didn't just cover up a disaster. She participated in creating one. My hands are shaking too badly to write more. The contaminated water has reached chest level, and I can feel my cellular structure beginning the final stages of systematic breakdown. The phosphorescence is beautiful in a way that transcends human aesthetics, like watching the aurora borealis composed entirely of death. If someone finds these records, remember that the shadows were trying to warn us. The patterns were always there, written in light and electromagnetic distortion, and the rhythmic clicking of instruments that measured more than radiation. They measured betrayal, measured institutional evil, measured the exact weight of human lives deemed acceptable losses. The Geiger counter has stopped clicking now. Either it's finally broken down completely, or I've absorbed so much radiation that the background noise has become indistinguishable from the measurement signal. I think the shadows are trying to show me something else. Something about the geometric patterns in the contamination spread, the way the isotopes arrange themselves in formations that seem almost intelligent, as if the radioactive material itself has developed a kind of emergent consciousness, a collective behavior that transcends individual atomic decay events. But that's impossible. I'm a scientist. I deal in facts and measurements and peer-reviewed theories, not mystical speculation about conscious contamination. The patterns I'm seeing are probably just the final hallucinations of a brain succumbing to acute radiation syndrome. Although, the mathematics do suggest some interesting possibilities regarding emergent complexity in radioactive decay systems. End of legible text. Remaining entries show severe degradation in handwriting quality, with increasing incoherence and mathematical symbols that do not correspond to standard notation. Water damage has obscured the final pages. Recovery note: document retrieved from Emergency Station C during post-incident investigation. Dr. Kellerman's remains were located approximately 3.7 meters from the writing surface, suggesting he continued documenting until the final stages of system failure. Radiation levels in the recovery area exceeded safe exposure limits for extraction teams by factor of 23. Classification status: redacted, pending federal review of institutional liability factors. Administrative addendum: all references to Dr. R. Hale in incident reports have been transferred to classified archives under national security protocols. Official records list the research director position as vacant due to administrative restructuring throughout the relevant time period. The New Haven facility remains under permanent quarantine. No further investigation is scheduled. Personal Research Archive, Dr. Kellerman. Location unknown. Day 89 post-Blackwater. Status: survivor. They found me 3 days later. Not the federal containment teams or the military units that had sealed the New Haven perimeter. Those bastards wrote me off as an acceptable loss the moment Hale's transport lifted off. It was a freelance extraction crew, the kind that specializes in retrieving valuable assets from quarantine zones for clients who prefer to remain anonymous. I'm writing this from what they call a clean room, a medical isolation facility somewhere in the Nevada desert, judging by the quality of light filtering through the reinforced windows. The walls are lined with lead sheeting and electromagnetic dampening materials that make my teeth ache. Everything here hums with the low-frequency vibration of air filtration systems working overtime to scrub radioactive particles from the atmosphere. My theoretical framework didn't just collapse in that flooded emergency station. It underwent complete nuclear fission. The shadows weren't hallucinations or optical distortions caused by electromagnetic fields. They weren't even warnings, as I'd convinced myself in those final delirious moments before the extraction team pulled me from the contaminated water. There was something else entirely. Something my radiation-addled brain had been too damaged to properly categorize, but which the medical team here identified within hours of running their diagnostic scans. Retinal scarring from direct exposure to beta particle radiation creates permanent blind spots in specific geometric patterns. The human visual cortex, attempting to compensate for these damaged areas, generates phantom images that the conscious mind interprets as moving shadows. Classic symptom of acute radiation syndrome affecting the ocular nervous system. I'd been hallucinating for weeks. Every shadow pattern I'd documented, every electromagnetic distortion I'd measured, every rhythmic Geiger counter signal I'd convinced myself was evidence of some deeper conspiracy. All of it was my brain desperately trying to make sense of sensory input from organs that were literally falling apart at the cellular level. The real contamination data I'd hidden in those sealed drives? Completely accurate. The isotope distribution patterns that seemed to suggest intelligent behavior? Standard dispersal models for heavy water reactor contamination events, exactly matching theoretical predictions for the type of breach that occurred at Blackwater. Dr. Hale's cover-up was real enough. The medical team recovered enough evidence from my documentation to trigger a federal investigation that's apparently ongoing. But her motivation wasn't part of some weapons testing conspiracy. She was just a career bureaucrat who panicked when faced with a disaster that would end her professional advancement and chose institutional self-preservation over human lives. Banal evil, the most common variety. The extraction team leader, a woman named Fisher who speaks with the flat pragmatism of someone who's pulled too many corpses from too many quarantine zones, explained it to me during one of our debriefing sessions. You were dying. Document radiation poisoning that advanced creates neurological symptoms that can mimic psychosis, paranoia, enhanced pattern recognition. Your brain was looking for meaning in random data because that's what brains do when they're shutting down. They try to make sense of the chaos right up until the moment they stop working entirely. She showed me photographs from the extraction site. The emergency station C, where I'd spent those final hours, wasn't a heroic last stand against institutional conspiracy. It was a flooded basement where a delirious scientist had nearly drowned while scribbling increasingly incoherent mathematical equations on water-damaged paper. The phosphorescent floodwater was contaminated groundwater mixed with chemical runoff from ruptured storage tanks. It glowed faintly under emergency lighting due to suspended particulate matter, not exotic isotopes creating localized gravity wells. My description of dancing shadows and organic fluid movement were classic hallucinations reported by radiation exposure victims in similar circumstances. I documented my own psychotic break with the methodical precision of a researcher conducting an experiment. The worst part? My theoretical breakthrough about electromagnetic distortions and shadow patterns had been published in 3 different scientific journals during the 1970s. Standard research into radiation-induced visual phenomena, available in any medical library. I'd simply been too arrogant to consult literature outside my narrow specialty, too convinced of my unique insight to recognize symptoms that had been cataloged decades ago. Even my paranoia about being written off as acceptable losses turned out to be partially delusional. The extraction team had been dispatched within 18 hours of losing communication with the New Haven facility. Federal protocols require retrieval attempts for all research personnel classified as strategically valuable, and apparently my radiation physics expertise qualified me for that designation, despite my increasingly erratic behavior. They would have found me sooner, but the contamination levels in that sector exceeded their equipment tolerances. They had to wait for specialized gear to arrive from Los Alamos before attempting extraction. I wasn't abandoned by a conspiracy. I was rescued by bureaucrats who considered me worth the expensive equipment required to fish me out of a radioactive swamp. The medical team has been very thorough in their debriefings. They've shown me video footage from the extraction, recorded through their hazmat suit cameras as they navigated the flooded research compound. I can see myself in the emergency station, hunched over a desk covered in waterlogged papers, mumbling calculations while contaminated water lapped at my chest. I look like a madman. A brilliant scientist whose mind had been systematically dissolved by ionizing radiation until only fragments of technical knowledge remained, spinning elaborate paranoid theories to explain why reality no longer matched my theoretical models. The extraction team found Voss's body in Laboratory 2, exactly where I'd left him after administering the potassium iodide. He'd been dead for at least 6 hours by the time I dragged him to the medical station. Radiation poisoning that advanced doesn't respond to emergency treatment. I'd been performing CPR on a corpse while hallucinating that he was still breathing. Another delusion. Another failure of perception caused by a brain that was literally cooking in its own radioactive juices. Dr. Hale did evacuate personnel according to established emergency protocols, though her timeline was delayed by approximately 14 hours due to her attempts to salvage classified research data before abandoning the facility. The falsified contamination maps I'd accused her of distributing were real enough. She'd been downplaying the severity of the situation to prevent panic among the research staff while secretly coordinating evacuation procedures with federal authorities. Cowardly and unethical, but not the systematic cover-up conspiracy I'd imagined. Just a frightened administrator who made bad decisions under pressure and prioritized bureaucratic ass-covering over transparent communication. The truth is simultaneously more mundane and more terrifying than my radiation-induced conspiracy theories. The Blackwater incident was exactly what the official reports claimed: a containment failure at an experimental reactor facility that resulted in widespread environmental contamination. No weapons testing, no deliberate dispersal, no grand conspiracy involving federal oversight committees. Just human incompetence and institutional cowardice, amplified by a technological disaster that exceeded our emergency response capabilities. The contamination spread follows predictable patterns based on wind currents, groundwater flow, and topographical features. The geometric progressions I thought suggested controlled dispersal were simply the mathematical reality of how radioactive material moves through natural systems. No intelligence required, just physics and chemistry doing what they always do. I've been in isolation here for 6 weeks now, undergoing experimental treatments for radiation exposure that would have been fatal without immediate medical intervention. The experimental treatments are working, slowly reversing the cellular damage and allowing my neurological symptoms to stabilize. My vision is clearing, The phantom shadows are fading, and my capacity for rational analysis is gradually returning. But I can't forget what it felt like to be absolutely convinced that I was uncovering a massive conspiracy while I was actually documenting my own mental breakdown. The certainty I felt, the clarity of the patterns I thought I was detecting, the sense of heroic purpose in exposing institutional evil, all of it felt completely real right up until the moment medical professionals explained exactly how radiation poisoning creates those specific types of paranoid delusions. Fisher tells me this is common among quarantine zone survivors. The human mind desperately needs explanations for traumatic experiences, and when rational explanations are insufficient, it creates elaborate fictional frameworks that feel more satisfying than mundane reality. Conspiracy theories are just ghost stories for people who think they're too smart for ghost stories, she said during our last session. Your brain needed a villain it could understand, so it created one out of institutional incompetence and bureaucratic cowardice. Much more comfortable than accepting that sometimes bad things happen for no reason except human stupidity and technological failure. The medical team is optimistic about my long-term prognosis. The cellular damage is extensive but not irreversible, and my cognitive functions are returning to baseline parameters as the residual isotopes are gradually cleared from my system. I should be able to resume research work within 6 months, though they recommend avoiding high-stress environments and any projects involving nuclear materials. They've offered me a position here at the facility, consulting work on radiation exposure protocols, drawing from my unique experiential perspective to improve emergency response procedures. The pay is excellent, the work is meaningful, and the location is sufficiently isolated that I won't have to explain my scarred hands and radiation-thinned hair to curious colleagues. But I've been thinking about something Fisher mentioned during our debriefings. She said the extraction team has pulled 17 researchers from various quarantine zones over the past 5 years. Industrial accidents, weapons testing mishaps, environmental disasters involving radioactive materials. All of them showing similar patterns of conspiracy theorizing and paranoid pattern recognition in their final days before extraction. 17 scientists, all convinced they were uncovering massive cover-ups, all eventually discovering that their elaborate theories were symptoms of radiation-induced neurological damage. The statistical probability of 17 independent conspiracy theories all turning out to be hallucinations seems unlikely. Fisher insisted this was just confirmation bias. I was looking for patterns that confirmed my desire to believe in hidden conspiracies, rather than accepting the more mundane explanation that radiation poisoning creates similar symptoms in similar people under similar circumstances. But last night, while reviewing my medical files, I found something interesting. The extraction team that rescued me was dispatched not by federal emergency protocols, but by a private contractor whose funding source is listed as classified pending institutional review. The same designation that appeared in my New Haven research files whenever questions of federal oversight were involved. And the medical facility where I'm being treated? The one that's supposedly helping me recover from radiation-induced paranoid delusions? It's located approximately 40 kilometers from the Nevada test site, in an area that was used for atmospheric nuclear testing during the 1950s. The same type of isolated location where they'd want to keep people who might have inconvenient questions about institutional responses to radiation disasters. I'm probably experiencing another episode of conspiracy theorizing brought on by residual neurological damage. Fisher warned me that recovery from this type of radiation exposure often involves recurring periods of paranoid thinking as the brain chemistry gradually stabilizes. But I've started paying attention to the patterns again. Not the phantom shadows this time. Those were definitely hallucinations caused by retinal scarring. Real patterns. Observable data that doesn't require exotic theories to explain. Like the fact that all 17 researchers rescued from quarantine zones were specialists in radiation physics, environmental contamination, or nuclear engineering. Like the fact that all 17 were involved in projects with potential military applications. Like the fact that all 17 were diagnosed with similar paranoid delusions that conveniently discredited any inconvenient observations they might have made about institutional emergency responses. Fisher says this is exactly how paranoid thinking works. You start with a few isolated facts and build elaborate explanatory frameworks that feel more satisfying than accepting coincidence or standard operating procedures. She's probably right. The most likely explanation is that I'm a damaged scientist whose brain was literally cooked by ionizing radiation, desperately trying to impose meaning on random events because accepting the meaningless chaos of the situation is too psychologically threatening. But I've been keeping careful notes this time. Not the frantic scribbling of a delirious mind, but methodical documentation of observable phenomena using proper experimental controls and peer-reviewable methodology. And the patterns are still there. The extraction team leader who rescued me has the same clearance level as Dr. Hale. The medical facility where I'm being treated receives funding from the same federal oversight committees that coordinated the New Haven evacuation. The experimental treatments I'm receiving are based on research conducted at facilities that specialize in weapons-related radiation exposure. 17 researchers, all experiencing similar hallucinations about institutional cover-ups. All being treated at similar facilities by similar medical teams funded by similar classified sources. It's probably nothing, just coincidence and confirmation bias, and the lingering neurological effects of acute radiation syndrome creating phantom patterns in mundane data. But I'm going to keep documenting everything. And this time, I'm going to remember that the most dangerous conspiracies are the ones that hide behind explanations of mental illness and institutional incompetence. The shadows aren't dancing anymore. But sometimes, late at night when the medical facility's air filtration systems cycle into their quiet mode, I can hear something that sounds almost like music. Rhythmic patterns transmitted through the electromagnetic dampening materials in the walls, too regular to be random mechanical noise, but too complex to be standard facility operations. It's probably just the building's electrical systems creating interference patterns in my damaged nervous system. The medical team says auditory hallucinations are common during the recovery phase of radiation exposure treatment. But it sounds suspiciously like the clicking patterns my Geiger counter was producing in those final days at New Haven. Before I learned that Geiger counters don't actually click in musical rhythms unless something is deliberately manipulating their detection circuits. The difference is that this time, I'm going to figure out what that something actually is. Medical file addendum, Dr. Fisher, extraction team leader. Classification, redacted. Subject continues to show excellent physical recovery from radiation exposure, but demonstrates persistent paranoid ideation patterns consistent with previous extractions. Recommend extending isolation period and increasing psychological intervention frequency. Note for review. Subject has requested access to technical literature on electromagnetic interference patterns in medical monitoring equipment. Suggest denying request to avoid reinforcing delusional thinking patterns. Administrative reminder. All documentation related to extraction operations should reference standard emergency protocols. No mention of specialized funding sources or institutional coordination beyond established federal disaster response procedures. The Nevada facility maintains operational security through therapeutic isolation protocols. No further intervention required at this time.